Alright, so before we jump into COVID, what are false moral narratives and how are they used? So, morality is very important because of how it is linked with violence and force. If we consider an action to be morally wrong, we consider it justified to use force in response to that action. For example, you are justified to defend yourself against assault. False moral narratives use a false moral premise to justify whatever kind of force the person or group making the narrative wants to commit. For example, if I want to be able to steal from others without consequences, I could propose a false moral narrative that owning property itself is theft, and therefore it's justified to steal that property back. The government is an agency built on the use of force and violence, and because of this, virtually everything the government does is justified by some kind of false moral narrative. And this brings us to COVID. We can easily reverse engineer the false moral narratives by looking at the behavior that governments have tried to force on their people. The most common of these being lockdowns, mask mandates, and vaccine requirements. The basic moral arguments behind these go something like this. Staying at home, wearing a mask, and getting vaccinated are all behaviors that reduce the risk of spreading COVID. Therefore, anyone who does not follow these guidelines is putting others at a higher risk of disease, which is morally wrong, and therefore we must force everyone to follow these guidelines. Now, like many have done, we could debate the efficacy of lockdowns, masks, and vaccines in actually reducing COVID spread. But not only does nobody seem to agree on the facts around these, but it's a losing battle, because if we go straight to debating efficacy, it means we've already accepted the false moral premise. The crux of the argument is this statement: putting others at a higher risk of disease is morally wrong. Debunking this is very easy, but we need a system of ethics to base our moral definitions on. For a system of ethics to be true, it must be universal. So, to say, it must apply to everyone at all times. If you're religious, an example of a universal system of ethics might be Christianity. If not, universally preferable behavior by the philosopher Stefan Molyneux is an entirely secular proof of universal ethics. When viewed from a universal perspective, the fact that I, as a biological organism, can spread germs, disease, or COVID without committing any particular action on my end or without even knowing I'm doing it means that the risk can never be reduced to zero. This means that everyone is always and always has been putting others at risk of disease, meaning being moral is impossible under this premise. When the quote-unquote moral behavior is not achievable, it means the force and violence being used in response to the immoral behavior will never end. And this is exactly what we're seeing all over the world. Okay, but what if we shift the goalposts a bit and say that staying home, wearing a mask, and getting vaccinated represents a moral level of risk, but going out, not wearing a mask, and not getting vaccinated represents an immoral level of risk? Well, this also doesn't work, because when it comes to universal morality, it's not a matter of degree, but of kind. Let's take murder as an example. Regardless of how you murder someone, it's still murder, and it's still wrong. What about killing someone in self-defense? Is that a moral degree of murder? No. It's an entirely separate kind of moral action that is distinct from murder based on the initialization of the use of force. One is universally immoral, and the other is universally moral. Risk, though, is something totally different because it's not immoral to do risky things. Now, I've heard drunk driving brought up as an analogy for not following COVID restrictions because both are actions that increase risk for other people in some way and have rules associated with them that are enforced by the government. But here's the thing. From a moral perspective, neither drinking, nor driving, nor the combination of the two are immoral in themselves. If someone drives drunk on their own property, they aren't doing anything morally wrong. Doesn't mean it's a good idea, but it's not immoral. When the risky action is regulated privately, all parties involved are consenting to that level of risk. Since, for example, public roads aren't private property, having rules against certain risks makes sense. And that's the biggest problem with the moral arguments around COVID restrictions. The resulting guidelines are enforced on private people and businesses, which affects the way people are allowed to interact with each other and those businesses. When it comes to risk, private actors must be allowed to determine their own levels of risk. This is why there is absolutely no problem with private businesses enforcing COVID restrictions within themselves. But for the government to force risk assessment decisions on private actors is an overreach. If private actors want to reduce their own risk, it is up to them to stay home, wear masks, get vaccinated, avoid crowds, or any of the other things. In conclusion, increasing the risk of spreading disease is not immoral, as the risk can never be fully eliminated, and every individual is responsible for choosing their own level of risk based on the decisions they make.